For centuries, across Scotland, England and Wales, thousands of women and some men were accused of witchcraft. They were dragged before courts, tried under laws that treated belief and superstition as fact, and many were executed. Their names were never cleared. In 1735, Britain repealed the Witchcraft Act, but it wasn't to admit a mistake. Instead, witchcraft was rebranded as fraud, and the victims of earlier hunts were quietly forgotten. Only recently has that silence been broken. In 2022, Scotland's First Minister offered a formal apology to the estimated 4,000 accused. The Church of Scotland has apologised too, but the pardons campaign, the fight to legally clear those names, is still ongoing. In England and Wales, no such national apology has ever been given, just scattered plaques, local memorials, and whispers of the forgotten. So if you haven't joined us before, I would feel that I should also just quickly introduce myself. I am a current member of the CPI. Now, that may be a bit of a surprise to those of you who might have heard of them in the past and weren't necessarily aware that we were still going today. Things have changed a great deal. Obviously, things are a lot more modern these days. So we might be doing podcasts like this. We might occasionally do investigations, film them, put them onto YouTube and that sort of a thing. And that brings us here to Easthollow, a quiet village with its own story, its own accused woman, and the question that still lingers in the air: can you ever exonerate the dead? This is the CPI, and you're listening to The Enchantment at Easthollow. Now, hello everyone, welcome to this new episode, and I'm extremely happy and rather excited to say that joining us here in Easthollow is Dr. Rachel Perkins-Moore. Now, she's an early modern historian whose research focuses on witchcraft trials in rural England. She's the author of Buried Voices, Memory and Witchcraft in Rural Communities, and she's joining us. So hello, Rachel, if you don't mind me calling you Rachel.
Oh, not at all. It's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me along.
Oh, you're very welcome indeed. I'm a member of the CPI, and so consequently, in some respects, Rachel and I fall on slightly different sides of the line when it comes to thoughts about the supernatural. Would that be fair to say?
That would be very fair to say, yes.
Could I just quickly ask, because we know that you actually also have a very interesting relative. I hope you'd be willing to just say a couple of words about her. You were related to someone who was in the CPI back in the 1920s and 30s.
So, yes, my great-great-grandmother is, in fact, Dorothy Perkins, who was a founding member of the CPI. So that's my link.
And an absolutely amazing link it is too. And another reason why it's an absolute pleasure to spend some time with you. Now, as I said, I know that our ideas and opinions might not necessarily coincide with each other, but I must just quickly ask before we get to the story at hand, what did you think of the work she did? I assume you heard her stories as you were growing up. So
yes, unfortunately, most of my family were involved in the supernatural in one way or another, either going out on investigations, being involved with the CPI. They were all believers, and I grew up with the stories of the supernatural and the CPI. So I think that's how I got into history. Being a non-believer in the supernatural, I decided to take a more factual route in my career.
So I assume, have you read many of the old files, or was it this one in particular that focused your attention?
I think I came across files as I was growing up. My parents obviously, relayed stories of the CPI and their supernatural endeavours. However, primarily I came across this case because of my research into charity web.
So I think if we can just briefly go back to the beginning of the story as it is documented in the CPI file. They weren't, of course, originally planning to stop here in Easthollow. They were off to a different location entirely. Their car broke down, and luckily Dorothy remembered that this village was reasonably close to where they were, because as they were making their way across the Easthollow moorland here, they spotted a monastery that had been, obviously was in ruins by that stage. And on the monastery, Dorothy noticed there were witch marks inscribed in the stone, which, as I'm sure you're well aware, but I'll just mention briefly for our listeners. These were symbols that people used to believe would some way protect themselves from evil spirits.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, they made their way into the village. How was this case useful for you in the research that you undertook?
Things that the community often relied upon until suspicions turned against her because of the witch trials. So having the CPI case and the information that we get from Dorothy, because she obviously, as you know, talks to Hope, who is an ancestor of Charity Webb. We have a little bit more of hearsay and testimonies to go on.
They arrived in the village, the three of them on that occasion. There was Dorothy, of course, Ernest and Bartholomew. They were quite pleased to find, I think, or Bartholomew was at least, to spot a pub across the road. But Dorothy had other plans, and she'd spotted a small shop that seemed to have very interesting items in the window. So she went across there, and that, of course, is where she did meet Hope, who you mentioned briefly just now.
Yes, Hope was the ancestor of Charity Webb, and she had a shop still on the same site that her ancestor had once lived. We obviously know it wouldn't have been the same building, but it was on the same site. And she had lots of herbs, candles, oil lamps, things like that in the window that obviously attracted Dorothy, being the supernatural enthusiast that she was.
And of course, Dorothy and Hope get chatting. I don't think at that point Dorothy revealed exactly who she was, because she was so interested and so kind of fascinated by all the items in the shop. I believe there was like vials of powders and herbs and flowers and all kinds of different things. And after a little while they were chatting, and then went back across to the pub just to catch up with the other two members of the team. And it was there, I believe, that Hope had some kind of dealing with the landlord. He had a problem in the pub, and she'd sprinkled something or other in the fire there.
Yes, apparently so. It seems as though she had inherited some of her white witch tendencies from her ancestor, and basically it seems as though she had carried on the family tradition.
Yes, that's right. And after a while, I think Dorothy and Hope returned to the shop, spent some more time there. I think Hope had several very interesting volumes on her shelves, several really rather quite old books. Dorothy was very pleased to be able to look through them. And I think within those books there was some mention, although Hope didn't say anything about it at the time, about the witch trials that had gone on in England during that period.
Yes, of course. And some of those notes that were taken by Dorothy at the time were some of the notes that I have used in my own books and dissertation.
And while Dorothy went back to the shop with Hope, I think Ernest and Bartholomew decided to stay on at the pub there.
They were always in the pub by the sound of it.
Well, I think so. I think Ernest was quite distraught about the fate of his car at the time that had broken down. But they were speaking to the landlord. I believe his name was Bernard. And he then mentioned to them there'd been some disturbances in the pub overnight, and there was one or two other spooky things going on, which I know you may not necessarily want to discuss now. But then Dorothy did come back from the shop, and the three of the team, then spent the evening doing their investigation.
So you mentioned the investigation that the CPI undertook at the pub. Those, however, were not documents that I used because they weren't factual. They weren't part of my research. I was more interested in the information that Dorothy found from Hope and her books regarding charity.
Yes, well, of course, that's fair enough. I'll just very shortly outline what did go on. I believe they split into 3 different rooms. Ernest spent some time. Well, in fact, they decided to spend 3 hours on the investigation. So Ernest was in the cellar, and 1 or 2 odd sounds and shuffling about and barrels moving, that sort of thing. Bartholomew was in the bar area, which I think had the most activity of all. There was various scratchings along the bar top, and you heard crying, wailing voice just beyond the pub door in the street. While Dorothy spent the evening largely uninterrupted, as far as I understand, just reading through some of the books that she did borrow from Hope, just trying to find some more information about her ancestors, the village, and other information about witchcraft in general, I think.
So it did seem at some point Dorothy did have a more sensible approach than the other two.
Well, it depends how you look at these things, I suppose. But I think it's from that Dorothy seemed to put the pieces together of who, because at that stage Hope hadn't told Dorothy who she was. So I think Dorothy kind of surmised from what she'd been reading that they were in fact related.
I'm very grateful for Dorothy for undertaking that research on that particular night, because obviously that was much more factual and much more beneficial to my research later on.
Yes, well, yes, you may say that, yes.
I do say that.
So then the next morning, I think the team got together in the pub. They sort of discussed what would be going on, what happened. And it was Dorothy primarily who was the one to say, I've got a pretty good idea of what might be happening here and what's been going on. And so she returned to Hope's shop and they had a reasonably serious conversation about it. But I think by and large, Hope just seemed to be quite relieved to be able to actually speak up and say who she was and who she had been related to.
And I think that's part of where I come in to some extent, because obviously Hope had certain thoughts and feelings about how her ancestor was accused and treated back in the 1600s. And we are still, as Hope did, still trying to rectify that and exonerate all of those people today.
And I think that's probably where we can trace the family line back quite a lot of clarity, because I think Hope was very much of a similar mind to you, that she was very keen to help Charity. You may not obviously necessarily agree that she wanted to help put her spirit to rest, but she was very keen on having her name exonerated, having her cleared, following all the vilification that she and other women had suffered.
Yes, absolutely. So her story has been kept alive by her descendants. And I think now there still is somebody in that area who is related to Charity and Hope. And it's wonderful history, and it's great that that is being kept alive and her name is being called out as somebody who was innocent. And we will continue searching for the truth for everyone accused.
And so I think that then finds us at the end of the story. It was a happy ending, I think, especially from Ernest's point of view, because his car was fixed by a local mechanic, but also I think probably more importantly, the spirit of the spirit of Charity was laid to rest. And I think that also made Hope feel a lot better about things, about her position in the community.
Yes, I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did. The last thing I'd like to say is, of course, we had that apology for the 4,000 accused in Scotland from the First Minister in 2022, which was actually made on International Women's Day. However, there has still been nothing formally from England and Wales, no apology, and we would still really like to push a bill through to formally pardon everybody who was accused of witchcraft. And I think if we keep bringing this up and keep pushing the stories of these trials, if we come together, we should be able to have an outcome, not just for Hope and her ancestors, but for many, many others.
Well, absolutely. And I think I can speak on behalf of the CPI to say we are fully behind that sentiment. Absolutely. Again, Dr. Rachel Perkins-Moore, thank you so very much coming on the show. It has been an absolute pleasure to meet you. Do you fancy a quick lemonade in the pub?
That would be marvellous. Thank you very much for having me.
No, thank you.
Thank you.